Welcome to YIVO. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO, and we're so pleased to have you here with us virtually for this program on Gil Ribak's new book, Confronting Representations of Black People in Yiddish Culture. We're pleased to have Gil with us for this talk, and it's going to be led by Devin Randolph, who we're also very pleased to have with us. I'll introduce them in a moment, but I just want to first say a very brief word about YIVO. We're a very special place for the celebration and contemplation of Jewish and Yiddish culture. We have an archive and a library with over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books, which researchers from around the world use. And we also have a variety of public programs like this. We have classes, we teach Yiddish, we have exhibitions, we do all sorts of things to bring the world of this culture to life and to explore it critically. And join us again if you're new to YIVO, and if you're a longtime fan, welcome back. So, Professor Gil Ribak is the Shirley D. Curson Associate Professor at the Arizona Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Arizona. Born and raised in Israel, Ribak came to the U.S. on a Fulbright Fellowship and completed a PhD in history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He held several academic positions, such as the director of the Institute on Israeli-American Jewish Relations at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. And his book, Gentile New York, The Images of Non-Jews Among Jewish Immigrants, was published by Rutgers University Press in 2012. In 2021 to 2022, Ribak served as the European Union's Marie S. Curie Senior Fellow at the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies at the Albert Ludwig University in Freiburg, Germany. And Devin Randolph is Clinical Assistant Professor in the College of Education at the University of South Carolina. He studies the everyday experiences of targeted youth and systemic inequities. His research includes work with Jewish and African American Understanding, the Historical Alliance. Jewish and African American Understanding, the Historical Alliance, Divergence and Convergence and Contours of Racism and Racial Anti-Semitism. Randolph earned his PhD in Foundations of Education from the University of South Carolina. So welcome to both of you. Thanks so much for taking part.
Thank you so much, Alex, for having us. And hello again. I want to dive in. I will say that there were a couple key considerations I was really thinking about. And I first would like to ask, can you tell me a little bit, Professor Ribak, about your thinking in writing this particular book in this particular time?
Thank you, Devin, and thank you everyone for logging on. This thing has been on my mind since writing my first book, Gentile New York, because that book looked at Jewish immigrants before, during, and after immigration, mostly after in New York, and it dealt a lot with the relationship with different ethnic groups such as Irish Americans, Italian Americans, German Americans, of course, what in Yiddish they called Yankees, meaning, old stock Anglo-Saxons. And the thing is, and also African Americans, but I saw that there was a different or different dynamics at play. And I don't want to even go to both positive and negative because it's even more complicated than that. And when I saw that, and there are a few pages in the first book about, relationship between Blacks and Jews, I started to work on that and thinking about a book that will focus on the Jewish perceptions of Black people. And I understood immediately that I need to start in East Europe because the immigrants do not come as a blank slate. They do not come as people who don't know anything about Black women and men, even though they have not seen them. And so that was like the very first kind of building stones. I published an article called, and it's a quote, Negroes should not be likened to Jews. It's a quote from a autobiography of a rabbi, Max Raisin. And I think that started the whole project. And I saw that there is so much to dwell on, and I did research in 3 different continents to take a look at those sources.
Great. As a follow-up, you said something that is really an important segue. So you start to open up the book, really talking about this preformed image, right? When we think about Eastern Europe, and we think about Jewish immigrants who arrived to America, there was this preformed image of I would say of Blackness or Black culture. Can you really speak to the Yiddish culture and also just the dynamics around American racial challenges that you start to talk about in the early 1900s? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, of course. So of course, many of our viewers know Yiddish is a language that started 10th, 11th century in the area which is the Rhineland today, also Bavaria. Like most languages, it's a fusion language with a component in from medieval German, about 70%, about 20% from what is called Loshen Kodesh, which is Hebrew and Aramaic. And over the years, as Jews moved to East Europe or were actually kicked out of Central Europe, it absorbed also Slavic components, which is about 10%. Now, when we're talking about imagery, back to your question, imagery of Black people, then there's a mashup of many sources. You have the translations into Yiddish of rabbinical sources from Hebrew and Aramaic. You have, of course, translations from European and American culture. So, for example, one of the books, Die Entdeckung von Amerika, the Discovery of America by Joachim Campe, a German, an 18th century German author, is translated to Yiddish with, the encounters of European explorers in Africa. Uncle Tom's Cabin was translated to Yiddish several times, also staged on the Yiddish theater in the Yiddish theater in New York several times, several different productions. So it's a very modern culture. It's never parochial, and it's very permeable. Yiddish culture was always very permeable to external influences, for better, for worse. And when we'll talk about racial language, racial codes, racial imagery, it was so in Eastern Europe, it absorbs whatever culture over there. And again, I showed the different, really a potpourri of sources. But when they come to America, a country that has very entrenched traditions of how to describe, how to behave toward African American, then Yiddish culture is very permeable and absorbs that.
So as a follow-up to this, you really pivot to this very complicated narrative that I want to unpack a little bit more in the beginning of your book. So we talk about this notion of preform imaging, right? And we talk about the relationship to blackness. I want to ask, when we think about cultural production, like even after immigrants arrived, could we talk a little bit about the relationship with Black communities in general? Was there a working assumption or absence or even a distortion that you really kind of complicate? And you call out very clearly this large influence around what was happening in the early 1900s, and it really pushed this very complicated history, but you say very clearly that this absence and this distortion is a part of this pre-informed narrative that really is very complicated. Can you speak a little bit more to that
Yes,
absence or that
absolutely.
distortion?
Yes, absolutely. So I think what happens is that, like many, let's say, other lower status groups in America, African Americans seem to many Jewish immigrants as the new world's incarnation of the peasantry. And that in and of itself is strengthened by the fact that the social economic relationship between blacks and Jews many times mirrors what Jews had in the old country. For example, Jewish peddlers going to among black population, black clientele, selling them stuff, or black clientele coming to Jewish-owned stores. So you have the socioeconomic relationship between them, sometimes mirroring again, in the Jewish mind, whatever they had with the peasantry. Now, that in and of itself doesn't tell the whole story because also as I showed in earlier articles in my first book, also the Irish and the Italians in America seem to them as the new country's peasantry. But with African Americans, there is another very important dimension, and that's the existing racial, language and hierarchy in America. And that's something that they cannot overlook, even if they're oblivious to some of that. And I mention in my book a peddler in Georgia in the 1880s going into a black family's home, and his brother and his I think it's his cousin telling him, "Are you insane? Don't sit and have lunch with them. They should come outside. The white population is looking at you. Don't do those things. You're breaking a taboo." So even if at first they don't really, you know, immediately know what the racial codes are, very quickly they do understand them. And they see them in the theater, they read them in the press, they read them in the literature, and they're affected by them. And I quote Toni Morrison, the Nobel Prize winner, who said, the first word that immigrants knew in English is okay. The second word was the N word, and I think even in the Jewish case, that seems to be right on.
Yeah, so important here. So that's a really, really important segue into the key kind of analytical move here, right? So what I hear and some of the takeaways is that when we think about immigrant culture, it wasn't simply imported from American racial context. It had its own kind of um, history or historiography, and that these representational actual moves complicated what we refer to as the assimilist argument, right? Because what you're saying very clearly is you're pushing for us to really think about not only representation or conventions around that, but honoring the Yiddish culture in terms of their own historical narratives and also social dimensions of what creates such narrative, and really speaking to that.
Yes, absolutely. It's a great point that you're making, because it's not just the American influence is very important, but that does not explain the East European background. And I give Yiddish culture agency, and again, for better, for worse, for those representations that many times are really they're quite unflattering, but they come out of Jewish life in East Europe. It comes out of Yiddish culture as it evolved during the centuries. And my first chapter, of course, deals with this evolution of ideas about blackness, and how do you imagine blackness? How does one group of people imagines another group of people, both of them, by the way, very maligned? How
Mm.
does it view another people that they've never met? And how would that affect the meeting point once they do meet?
Yeah, so we're now talking really about radicalization without direct contact, right? So we're really talking about something really important. The irony is that when we think about Eastern European Jewish encounters with racial ideology, it's actually the same scientific reason that we're constructing around race as being an inferior, but also how African Americans are also navigating that inferiority as well, right? And so that
Yes.
is the complicated irony in all of this, is really being very careful to really think about. And we're not even beginning to talk about the pseudoscience that you allude to, right, in your book, in
Yeah.
terms of when we're thinking about this degradation around race, we
Yeah.
do have to layer on some of the pseudoscience challenges that's really evolving around this time, which I think is really, really important. And I think when we think about the racial ladder and the pseudoscience, at some point, we have to really speak to kind of the Southern, and you start to talk about the Southern influence. You speak to a specific case around the Southern influence around Leo Frank and just what that actually meant for racial dimensions and identity, which I think for our viewers, I think is really important to understand not only the role of media in this particular conversation, but also the Southern kind of influence during this time frame. Because it's important for us to recognize that we are really talking about um, up until the early 1940s, right? And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
if we fast forward present day, right? And I know I'm jumping ahead here. If we fast forward present day, we talk about the pre-informed encounter, right? And in terms of imagery to blackness,
Yeah.
how would we receive current representation, especially around relationships with these important groups.
No, those are all great comments. I think, the great black leader W.E.B. Du Bois, when he wrote the Soul of Black Folks, iconic book in 1903, and he referred there to the role, what he saw as the negative role of some in the South, of some what he called Russian Jewish immigrants, that he said that he showed that they argued that they exploit the sharecroppers and so on. And later on, half a century later, he changed that. He deleted any, references to Jews or Hebrews. He said the immigrants. Now, the thing is, if you look at Yiddish visitors to the South who write about the very same topics, they're sometimes more critical than Du Bois toward the local Jewish population. Why are you doing this? And I'm thinking about writing an article, W.E.B. Du Bois's Yiddish Echoes, because in many ways they are already in the very same time frame. He wrote it in 1903. I'm looking, through the 1920s. Visitors who are very, very critical of Southern Jews, including the Yiddish-speaking Southern Jews, and they beyond the critique, I think they allow themselves, because it's in Yiddish, to say, okay, it's an internal Jewish critique. But you can see a lot of the things that came up in the souls of black folks in 1903, 10, 20 years later, come in what Abraham Kahan and other, Yoel Entin and other visitors who, by the way, do interject their own racial conceptions of African Americans. They're not free of that, and that's what, as you said, complicates the picture.
Yeah, and here for reference to the question, I was drawing from the beginning of the introduction on page 10, when we start to see this conversation around the Yiddish press and the Jewish labor movement, and we start to see this influence, especially around this important conversation around Southern influence with Leo Frank. So it's referenced in the middle of page 10
Mm.
for context, for
Yeah,
those that have the book right in front of them.
yeah,
And so I also wanted to really talk about kind of, you mentioned location, but then you start to talk and you move very quickly to talk about the spatial proximity and its meaning. And you use a very important example to really highlight this. So and I'm summarizing here, what you say is that when it comes to this spatial phenomenon, you talk about Jewish immigrants and black migrants often lived in the same neighborhood, right? And also shopped and worked in kind of similar industry. And you talk about this proximity as an opportunity for us to begin to create some hope in terms of helping important relationships. Can you unpack this a little bit in terms of the spatial proximity and what it means historically in the conversation as you make the key consideration across the book? But can you also talk about the meanings for us as the various folks that are logged on today in terms of some tangible outcomes?
yeah. So I think this is a very important question with many layers in it, because the residential patterns are not flattering to begin with. You have covenants not to rent to black tenants. I looked at Yiddish ads, Yiddish paper press ads for housing, and sometimes they refer to, this is a black neighborhood. Maybe you want to think again. I quote a study of a white sociologist who studied East Harlem in the turn of the 20th century, and he says, Jews and Italians get along, Italians and blacks get along. He said Jews and blacks not a great mixture. But then I think, but I want to go back to what you said, because from the 20s and the 30s. And I mentioned that there is an improvement because they start to know one another. There is more knowledge about African American life, which is projected, especially after World War One, and they start to write more about that. Now, it does not mean that that change is immediate, It does not mean that it's across the board, but I believe that in the 1920s, you can see, um, you know, Yiddish writers, editors, intellectuals starting to look at African Americans as potential allies. Now, again, I don't want to overstate the case. I do not want to romanticize that. They still sometimes they refer to what they see as African American inferior or inferiority, what they see it. But they start saying, well, you know what? Maybe there are uh, contact points here that we can build upon. And because I hear what you're saying, we do need hope today. We need a lot of that. And I do think that the book shows very critically, a lot of the negative effects, but it also shows the preoccupation in Yiddish culture with the situation of African Americans. The idea that lynching is in which it's inherently bad. It's inherently bad. I mentioned Yosef Potoshu there's a novella called Lynching, which has racist imagery. It has racist imagery, even. But on the other hand, it says, look, Jews cannot get involved with that. This is inhumane. This is
Mm.
inhumane. You cannot do that. You cannot even stand as a bystander without fighting against that. So, and I appreciate your question bringing about, those seemingly opposite, poles, but they exist, they coexist.
Yeah, they coexist, and you speak directly to this in your conversation around travel narratives, right? On page 32 of the book. I was highlighting so much information here, but I really like your positionality in terms of how we look at the strange and savage creatures. But what you're really saying here is there is this spatial proximity to this relationship, and it has important consideration and meanings for important communities, because you begin to talk about the Romanian born Jew, and then you also make what I think a very clear description between what I refer to as Jewishness, right? You did not make a collective conversation, but you spent time really talking about various inclusion and diverse relationships to Jewish identity that I think is important, because I think oftentimes, and you use the word romanticize, I would also say oftentimes there's the move to not specifically speak to the divergent or even the emergent nature and personalities, and also dimensions of African American communities as well as Jewish communities. And I think that's important to do as we think about this particular scholarship, because if we're looking across scholarship during this particular time, right, it's important to identify and not debate, and I would argue putting all groups together, right? I think it's really
Yes.
important to understand the divergent nature of each group. So I appreciate reading the the piece and thinking about how we think about travel narratives, and what that means as well.
Yeah, I think when you mentioned Romanian Jew, I think it's Konrad Berkovicki, the
Yes.
ethnographer, who goes to Harlem in the early 20s, I believe, and he writes a very interesting piece called the Black Blocks of Manhattan, in which he goes and he looks at the black population and he looks at black Jews. And he says, and he's writing to other Jews, and he says, look, can't you see? They're like us. Because he says you have their, and he describes, today you cannot do that because it's a very racialized thing. But he says the black Jews, they're bow-legged, hook-nosed like us. He called them, he refers to falashim, or today you don't use that term, but Ethiopian Jews. And I think you're right that the word community is sometimes overused in American
Mm,
political discourse. That's why I write populations, because I don't think there is a kind of monolithic black community. There's not a monolithic Jewish community. And you're very correct to point out that there are different groups there. And Belkovicki, for example, he's trying to show incredulous Jews. He said, look, you have black Jews, because that's something that until the 20s and the 30s, people don't accept that. I mean, there's there's Harry Roskolenko, a Jewish radical, who said to his mother, "Hey, mother, there are black Jews in Harlem." His mother, she's Russian born. She doesn't believe him. He said, "Hey, what happened if my sister will try and marry one of them?" She slaps his face, and he said that ended my sociological query. But so there, both populations are diverse, and the diversity in attitudes, I think, is shown through in this book.
Yeah, so that really, like, if I had to like take away from your response there, we're really talking about this asymmetric in terms of asymmetric mobility and actually acknowledging how important that looks, especially when we think about social as well as economic considerations in the early 1930s. When we think about the term community that you rightfully call out, and its usage over time, it becomes very problematic. And it also really speaks to the challenges when we are trying to make a comparison, and honoring not honoring the experiences of said groups, which I think is very important here. And you make that argument when we start to get into looking at the Yiddish press and the political and the economic rights, right? You talk about the attitudes towards Black people in the Yiddish press, but you was very careful to say, wait, if we're thinking about this conversation around upward mobility, we have to understand its relationship um, from the early 1900s to present day. Like we really have to understand why that relationship is important, and then we also have to understand what were some considerations from that.
Yeah.
And you really start to get into the heart of what it means to think about political and economic rights. So can you talk briefly about what were some lessons learned from you in writing not only this book, but specifically when you started to think about, and you highlighted it very beautifully, they all deserve political and economic rights, and you do speak specifically to this notion of these different attitudes. Could you tell me some of your thinking around that?
Yes, so in that chapter, in that particular chapter, I refer to something in Yiddish called Menschlichkeit, which is humanism, humanity, which does not, in the historical case, in this historical case, it does not rule out that people would make some racist utterances, even racist for the early 20th century. But there is already somewhat of a recognition of a common human shared destiny, and even the people who are, saying, for example, David Hermalin, a very successful writer, was considered to be a women's writer, and he writes, he says, well, African Americans, maybe in 100 years they'll be, will be able to be American citizens. Right now they're too ignorant or whatever. But then he says, in another place, segregated schools are wrong. Why should black kids and white kids study in different schools? So you see the internal clash sometimes among people who are, yeah, they do internalize what you might call, racist approaches, but the common human characters of that say, hey, you cannot treat people like that. As the quote you used, they deserve all the political and economic rights. You cannot treat this. That's what I said. The Menschlichkeit, this humanity, it still shows through. And by the 20s and the 30s, it shows through to the extent that the usage of the spelling of the N word declines. By the 30s, you can hardly find it. By the 30s, you can hardly find it. There is more attention to white racism, more attempts to even compare the situation of Jews in Eastern Europe to the situation of African Americans, especially in the South, especially in the
Mhm.
South. To the again, to the extent that one of the there is a there is the Morgan Journal, one of the Orthodox Yiddish dailies. It had for a few years it had this this column that someone goes up to people on the street, of course, if they're Jews, ask them a couple of questions, and I quote when they ask people, and then someone says, and this is like the early 20s when you have pogroms in Eastern Europe, but one of the man there says, well, you know what? I think South African Americans in the South suffer even more than Jews in East Europe, something that 20, 30 years beforehand was unthinkable to say. So yeah, I think there's definitely a learning of a learning curve there.
Yeah, I mean, and I think as a follow-up, I mean, I could say that when we think about the relationship, we know that it's probably one of the most documented and contention dimensions of Black Jewish encounter, right? And we haven't begun to talk about the conversation around this dimension of encountering with both communities. So there's something that happens more often than we realize in our positionality. So when we think about the dimensions, how do we how do we not demonize the Jewish community as it relates to mobility, and how do we minimize uh, that conversation in the context of mobility with Black communities?
Yeah,
Because
that's
I think that
when we
that's
met.
a important kind of contentious relationship that often falls into that narrative.
No, yeah, this is a great question. And when we met, if you remember last spring for the first time here in Tucson, you gave me a great quote that I'm using it, and thank you for giving it to me. I don't plagiarize, it's yours. You said historical narratives should not be weaponized. And
Mm,
this is very important for me in this book, that you have, of course, negative things and racist thing, and it's a critical study. But on the other hand, it also shows a lot of empathy and sympathy. It also shows preoccupation with the situation of African Americans. And I think your point that you made earlier about not making those generalizations, you know, when I talk to Jewish audiences, and they might say, all African Americans are anti-Semitic, and you say, how can you say? Do you think that Kanye represents all African Americans? I'm not sure he represents himself on any given day, and so you can, and that's the same thing with this, with Yiddish culture, because what I show is that alongside some of the, offensive cartoons and jokes and all those attitudes and plays, there is preoccupation with African Americans, with their suffering, that Yiddish playwrights are almost obsessed with them, and they show African Americans as Jesus on the cross. And so that ambivalence, I hope, comes across in my book, and that I hope will help not only not to demonize, but show that Jews were within American society with the group that was mostly, I don't think you can compare them to any other population that was so preoccupied with what's going on with African Americans. Some of it, of course, you might say, yeah, it's self-interest because they said, and some of them say it in the book, after African Americans, they're going to move on to us. But you can see sincere preoccupation with the situation of African Americans and trying to help. It's until the 1930s, it's not mainstream, but you can already see the precursors of what will happen in the 50s and the 60s. And of course, NAACP, that when it's established, I mean, the Jews are overrepresented in the board of directors.
yeah, so you start to see some of the structural contingency factors, but you also start to see labor organizing. You start to see that this encounter begins to really produce important moments among solidarity. I think it's
Yeah.
important for us, because that is the challenge for us to be very careful in which part we jump into in terms of the relationship. And I think that that's why this book gives us a really great foundation to understand some of the key considerations to begin to think about in terms of social mobility, in terms of just representation more specifically, and even thinking through some of the specific industries that begin to respond to some of those challenges, especially when we start to think about the war and multiple challenges that are happening at that time. So I think
Yeah.
that is important.
Yeah, in some of my lectures, I always, when people talk of Black-Jewish relations, there is the very last book that Martin Luther King wrote, came out posthumously after he was murdered, um, which is called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And I show my students, I show, or adult learners, what he wrote. King was very concerned about Black-Jewish relations, and he said, "Look, even if you have cases of Jewish racism, we have cases of Black anti-Semitism." He said that should not derail us. That should not derail us because he said we have a fundamental interest, we have fundamental interest in improving American society. And that's what, you can say about King in general, and not just King, but many, Bayard Rustin, maybe many of the leaders of the Southern Christian Leadership Council, Black Southern leaders, many of the ministers, Ralph Abernathy, Bayard Rustin, who had, a vision about Black-Jewish relations that we should not forget, that we should not forget.
Yeah, so when we think about this embodying kind of this social possibility, and we think about the narrative function of Blackness, what conversation would you give to some of the ethical considerations? Like, so we start to hear the conversation about blackface that's brought up. You mentioned earlier the decline in terms of using Negroes, and then you talk about this the evolution that you see scholars writing during this particular time. But I want to pose a complicated something that I feel that is probably more contentious is how do we play how do we understand the ethical considerations to when you start to see the role of media and also the conversation around um, images of blackface. And I'm not even making the move to how we still see, right? We if for those that watch the Super Bowl, that would probably be a prime example um of a very important decentering that happened right in the halftime show and in terms
Yeah.
of why that happens. But I really want to talk about some of the ethical considerations that you call out. And you do that I think in a just juxtaposed position. But can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. You mentioned the Super Bowl. I mean, last week, the President of the United States shared a video of the Obamas with their faces superimposed on apes, which even, you know what? I have examples of that happening in this book. Late 19th century, early 20th century, but even then, those are not very common. You have apish, references to African Americans or Black people in general. They're not too many, and that's 140 years ago. But the fact that something like that can happen last week, not ancient history, that the President of the United States can share such an offensive imagery shows that, you know what, maybe we have not evolved that much. Maybe we have not, that I do think that the civil rights movement's effect on American history was dramatic. It was dramatic. They managed to reach unprecedented achievements. But at the same time, and that's something we should keep in mind, some of the issues that I point to in this book did not go away. They did not go
Mhm.
away. And the example with the Obamas is which is appalling, and you cannot believe that this is 2026. But it shows you how that imagery, the potency of that imagery, how relentless it is in a sense
Mm.
that it comes back and comes back and comes back again. And I think it's a very interesting and very telling about American popular and mass culture today.
Yeah, and as a follow-up in chapter 5, you talk about a heavy bodily scent, right? And you talk about black characters in Yiddish prose. Would you agree, based on your most previous statement, would you agree that when we look at how that looks in terms of the Yiddish prose, would you agree that at some point, the Jewish when we talk about the Jewish communities, would you agree um, that some of the scholarship begins to, because you talk about it, but do you agree that that your book seems as if it's written for early 19th century, but would you agree that it's probably more timely that we still see some of those things in real time?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say chapter 5 is interesting because when I talk about some of the writers, when I'm talking the early part of that chapter is about more pulp schlock, kind of lowbrow writers who have less concerns about racial attitudes. The ones that, the heavy bodily scent, which is a quote from Boris Glasman, uh, uh, an author that was on the far left, kind of a fellow travelers of communism, and he thought of his literature as fighting against racism. The same with Yosef Opatoshu. They think that their literature is fighting against lynching, against Jim Crow laws. But then, so this is the moral aspect, but the aesthetic aspect that they still describe their black characters, both women and men, as oversexed or could be apish or this and that. And this clash between the moral side that they're saying we're fighting against racism, but their aesthetics are still rooted within racial imagery. I find that fascinating
Mhm.
because until this very day, you might see people who are sure that they're anti-racist and all that, but the mind has habits of its own, and I think this chapter shows very clearly the clash of the moral and the aesthetics, sometimes within the same text, within the same writer.
Yeah, so this moral and aesthetic kind of dynamic is it's really important because we see, and I'm looking at two questions that kind of came across. So I'll address them in this order. The first was how do we counteract the anti-Semitism and racism that's persuasive in the United States? What steps might we take in a peaceful mode to promote a more democratic country without violence? That's the first question that I think is a nice segue from this particular chapter, and I would love to hear your response.
If I can go back to Martin Luther King Jr., I think what Dr. King did, he wasn't only a visionary leader, he was an astute leader, he was a savvy leader because he knew how to build coalitions. And I do think that building coalitions here is key. Blacks alone cannot fight racism, Jews alone cannot fight anti-Semitism. Those populations are minority populations. I believe that we can work together to build those coalitions that unfortunately from the late 60s, early 70s were falling apart. It's also has to do with the falling apart of the American center, you might say, the political center that could not hold. And we have radicalization, right wing and left wing. But I do think that if you look back at Dr. King's legacy of building coalition, this would be the way. He understood it. He wrote a lot about that. It's not coincidental that that was the heyday of what you might call Black Jewish Alliance, even though it's more of an alliance of Black elites and Jewish elites. But still, I do think that that is a path forward. That is a path forward. And the quotes that from his last book and also things that in press conferences he embodied uh, a different way to go about fighting for one's rights. And I think that's the model that we can hope, can aspire to follow.
Yeah, and I think to add to that conversation and that question, which I think was a beautiful question, we see mutual solidarity that comes from shared exclusion. We see this happen in We also see this happen also in the relationship with historically Black colleges and universities, right? We see this when we think about Professor Ernest Berensky, and just his relationship to Tougaloo College in Mississippi. So we see some demonstration projects, or we see some some opportunities to learn from these particular social experiments, I would say. We also see that the solidarity and the shared exclusion actually serves as a powerful way to see how organizations such as the organization themselves, how the organization YIVO and also Jewish Federation and all of these organizations can really serve as really key lessons learned. So thank you for that. Really talking about and thank you for that question. The next question that I think was posed that I will read is I would like to move to the conversation to the East. Can you talk about how Blacks were portrayed in Yiddish culture in Eastern Europe? And can you put that in context of how that compares to portrayals of Black in Polish, Hungarian, and Romanian, etc.? And I think we started talking about that, and I know I had it highlighted in the book, but this was a question that came up from Mark.
Thank you, Mark. This is a question that my first chapter deals with because it goes back to even to antiquity, biblical, rabbinic sources, then medieval sources, and it's very important to note that indeed East Europe until the 20th century was part of the world with virtually no black population, to the extent that, for example, I quote someone called Elias Newman, who 50 years after the fact still remember that as a 13-year-old boy, he saw a black man in Krakow. That was in 1913. So the lack of black population, that's why I call imagining blackness is, of course, one of the most important thing, and that is shared between the Yiddish culture and culture in Polish, culture in Hungarian, and so on. I think in a footnote I put there is a reference to the way Polish culture described Native Americans, again, without viewing them, without knowing them, but as a symbol of barbarity and all that. And I think it's very important to note that, like Yiddish, those uh, cultures were always permeable by external influences. Polish, Hungarian, Serbian, Italian immigrants who come to America are not a clean slate. They have seen images of African men and women. It has to do also, of course, with the legacy of European colonialism and imperialism. I show in my book the writings of explorers to Africa that denigrate, they either denigrate or really ridicule Black people. I mean, there are a couple of writers, medieval Jewish writers, that refer to Africans eating grass and behaving like animals and all that. But that's something in East Europe. It's not just Jews, of course. It's a much larger phenomenon of cultures that imagine blackness. They don't have virtually any black population, but they already have enough information, however skewed and sometimes incoherent. They have enough information to imagine blackness, and I think Jews are, of course, part of that. Whether it's travel literature, whether it's literature which is not travel, whether it's from religious writings. The Hebrew Bible has some references to Black people that, again, not all of them are flattering. So I think, yeah, I think that East European societies were not different from, I mean, non-Jewish East European societies were not very different from Yiddish culture in that respect.
Yeah, and I also want to bring attention to when you get to the ending of the book, you start to talk about this influence and this racial discourse in the Yiddish culture. And can you tell me kind of some of um, some of the key takeaways for you. Because it's almost as if you leave us in a very aspirational. Like I felt, that, and I go back to using the word hope and just kind of really unpacking like current realities and where do we go from here? I mean, that you cite that and you talk about Dr. Martin Luther King. When you were getting to the last kind of chapter or epilogue in the book, um, how should we process or feel? Should we feel aspirational? Are we optimistic about kind of the current
You
reality?
know, this is a very deep question, and I'm not sure I have a good, SAT answer for that because I think it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed
Okay.
bag because there is definitely, you can see an upshot, you can see definitely an improvement in the imagery of African Americans in Yiddish culture and among Jews in general. At the same time, the Great Depression brings with it the very first, I would say, the very first arguments in the Jewish press, not just Yiddish, about black anti-Semitism. You have the Harlem riots of 1935. There's a lot of Jewish store owners are in Harlem, in Chicago, and in other places are saying, it's usually black perpetrators. The question of black criminality or supposed black criminality is part of chapter 3. But so I think it's a mixed bag. You have definitely among certain groups, whether it's the radicals, the Communist Party, labor movement, and Bohemians. Black artists find Yiddish very interesting. You have Cab Calloway and Ethel Waters and other black performers, Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, of course, singing in Yiddish and see it as a cool thing. And it's almost like a jazz thing to speak in Yiddish, but at the same time, there is more clash because the Great Depression brings economic woes, and residential patterns are not, are not great there. So that's why I think I'm trying to keep it real, so to speak. I show the hope, I show the improvement, but I show the continuing, lingering problems.
And I would also say, when we think about these residential patterns, they look different when we think about gender and how that interfaces with Black culture and Yiddish culture as well. When we think about the role of Black men compared to Black women, compared to um,
Absolutely.
opportunities for upward mobility. So a great response to a very, very challenging question. I
Super
would
challenging.
I would also ask a question that came up, and this question by Prince I would say that the image of African American have been greatly improved in mostly non-religious circles. However, in more religious uh, communities, those same stereotypes still exist, all while living most closely to African Americans.
Yeah,
Um,
Haredi, yeah,
Already,
the
excuse
ultra
me. Already,
Orthodox.
yes.
Yeah, I think that is a later dynamic, and it has to do with what sociologists call white flight, because what happens is that in the 50s and the 60s, many times Jewish communities, because of blockbusting, because of red zoning, and the policy of real estate brokers, but also local government. Boston is a great case. You have other cases. Real estate brokers prefer to try and vacate Jewish neighborhoods, saying that they believe that redlining, thank you, they believe that uh, Jews would be more amenable to accepting black population moving in comparison to the Irish, to the Italians, the Poles, whether it's Chicago or Boston or New York. So what happens is that many times the middle class or upper middle class Jews move out, and those who stay behind are working class Jews, and especially ultra Orthodox. And that's where you have the Crown Heights, riots of 1991. But of course, already by the late 60s, there's more clash on the African American side, more Caribbean blacks, because West Indies blacks were more of the immigrants, and in the Jewish case, more of the ultra Orthodox. And indeed, it's a phenomenon that I would say from the 60s on, it has to do. That's the debris, so to speak, of white flight. That the two population are stay behind, and you have deteriorating urban services, municipal services, and they tend to clash. I do think that that's also solvable, and you had, initiative to try and solve that, but there is still a lot to be done there.
Yeah, certainly. The follow-up comment, redlining East New York, Brownsville, Crown
Yes, yes,
Heights.
exactly.
We often think about this as um, the residential, not only the residential patterns, but also thinking about the degree of economic mobility that begins to unfold, and also this occupied positionality that happens in communities. So, um, whether it's the landlord problem, which is probably more a common
Yeah.
conversation that we have, or we see cases of lending, and how that might look. And I would also argue when we think about big banks and institutions, we've had some recent and still continue to have some more recent cases about these challenges that we see around social and economic mobility, which I think is important for us to acknowledge as well. Um, and a follow-up question that we see is there anything distinctive about the Israeli Jewish American on this? Um,
That's a very interesting question, and that leads me back to the Ethiopian Jewish question, because already in the first chapter, when I covered the East European background, there's a lot of attention from the late 19th century, but definitely early 20th century on, to Ethiopian Jews. And you have all sorts of Jewish writers trying to come up with, racial theories that Ethiopian Jews, yeah, they're black, but they're different. That's including Konrad Berkovic, the Romanian ethnographer that you mentioned. So you have much more attention to that. And I would say in Israel, the situation of Ethiopian Jews is very different from African Americans. Yes, there is a lot of racism, against them. Their situation is sometimes, very, there's needs to be so much more improvement. But Israel doesn't have the legacy of slavery. It doesn't have the legacy of chattel slavery. So they don't occupy the same, I would say, social cultural place that African Americans still play in American society, because of the very special, and especially in a bad way, the very special course of American history. So I would say in Israel, it's closer to the way to black immigrants into other countries. And of course, there's the question of Jewish solidarity. Ethiopian Jews are Jews, and in Israel, that kind of trumps other priorities. So despite the very fact that they're discriminated against, the country as a country tried to bring them from Africa, risked Mossad agents, Air Force pilots, whatever, in the 80s and then into the 1990s, to try and bring them from Ethiopia under very difficult situation in the Horn of Africa in those years, a very violent turmoil. So I would not. I think if Israelis in America, whether they bring that I don't know. I'm not sure that has been studied, but I think the situation of Ethiopian Jews in comparison to African Americans, it's quite different because of very different historical paths.
Yeah, and I think it also speaks to the very important conversation around using the terminology Jews of color.
Yes.
And when we start to see research and scholarship around language and thinking about some of the effects of making that decision, I think that begins to be very, very complicated. So thank you for making that distinction, and also thank you for um, And I'm reading the question, and thank you for that great question. And I want to say that might have been um, Mark that followed up with that question. Um, let's see if we have any other questions.
Oh, and I just want to mention because the book is called Crude Creatures, and I need to, I think, to explain the title.
Oh, here we
It's a
go.
quote. It's a quote from the iconic Yiddish writer Sholem Aleichem or Sholem Rabinovich. That was his name. Sholem Aleichem is "How do you do?" That was his pen name, and it's from Motel, the Cantor's son, basically the Cantor's son, which shows a 9-year-old boy on his very first day in America sees black people on the subway in New York. And so this is the very first time. This is the very first time that he sees black people. And that's what the book starts with. I asked my students, do they think that Motel, that 9-year-old boy, but of course it's Sholem Aleichem, is it a racist? Is it a racist description? Because their fingernails, their lips, their hair is like their noses is like taken aback, and some of them said it is, but most of them said it's not because this is the way. It's a boy who sees black people for the very first time, and I recalled Maya Angelou's writing in her memoirs about coming to Europe for the very first time. And I think it's in the former Yugoslavia that people see a black person and they're taken aback. But then they come and they talk to her, and she says, "You know what? I don't blame them." She said, "If I were in an African village and I would see a white person for the very first time, and we have reports about that they're demons and all that. So the very first encounter should not be I would say indicative of later attitudes, right? The that in a, and I have a small section in the second chapter about what happens when Jewish immigrants see black people for the very first time. It's like, whoa! But for example, Malka Lee, a very important Yiddish poet, she says I cannot. She sees like Motel, but this is in real time, not a novel. She sees black people for the very first time in the subway. She says, I'm. She's attracted to them. She says, I cannot take my eyes off of them. And in the 30s, the 20s and the 30s, she would write a lot of poetry against racism and amazing poetry. So you can see that the amazement of seeing a black person is not necessarily negative.
Yeah, and I think a follow-up question, two-part question, was um, does the book address the attitudes of recent immigrants? And then a follow-up question is, do the concept of the virtual Jew, which is used especially in medieval studies, it would seem to apply here too as a parallel when knowledge of Black precede actual acquaintance of any typical ideas and representation having a life of its own that's traveled around the world with or without actual Black presence.
I think this is a great question because there is an equivalent of the imagined Jew and the imagined black person. I think there is a certain equivalent. Um, I do not deal with my book ends in the Great Depression, ends in the 1930s. I don't really deal with, I can only do as much in one book. I do refer to the fact that I quote, I believe it's Richard Wright, Black Boy, growing up in rural Arkansas, when he said very candidly, he said, "Look, we African Americans still imbibed Christian imagery of Jews. So as Christ killers, as bloodsuckers, what have you." And he said, "It's not," and it's very candid of him, very frank of him. Wright writes, "It's not because we envied them; it's because we had this Christian legacy." And I think with black people, it also there is a lot the same way Jews were imagined by Shakespeare. England didn't have Jews, but he still could have Shylock, the Merchant of Venice. You can see the same thing with black people that are imagined in European culture. Of course, European culture after the 15th century has imperialism and colonialism to have a very, very specific set of images, excuse me. But I would say there is a certain parallel here of imagining people you have never met and sometimes demonizing them because you have never met them or because you read all sorts of uh, skewed sources about them. So there's a certain historical parallel there. I don't go too much into that. I don't have a lot of. stuff about the Middle Ages, I refer to that in the introduction in the first chapter. And then, but early modern period is definitely covered.
Thank you. I want to make sure that I did address all the questions. And I'm sorry, Amy did pose a question that I did not see, and I'm pretty sure we will share that information about social media handle and also posting that information so that way folks continue to follow this important conversation. So sincere apologies, Amy, for not seeing that question earlier. I want to open up for any additional questions that um, folks would like to ask of Professor Ribak.
And you can always, email me, shoot me, and hopefully I'll be able to answer that if you do not want to come forward or you cannot right now.
And I want to especially thank Vivo for organizing this very important conversation. I will encourage everyone, and I know that there will be a link that is available to Professor Ribak's book, Confronting Representation of Black People in Yiddish Culture, Crude Creatures. And thank you, Julia, for posting the link to the book and as well as contact information for Professor Ribak. I want to again thank you all for such an important conversation, and I look forward to continue conversations around this important book. And again, this book is entitled Confronting Representation of Black People in Yiddish Culture, Crude Creatures. Professor Ribak, I enjoyed this particular conversation today. I look forward to us meeting in person. And thank you again for this important work and very timely conversation in Jewish culture, as well as understanding imagery and representation
Thank you,
between.
Devin. I really
Yeah,
appreciate our conversation. Thank you so much.
thank you.